Thank you, Rosie. Thank you for joining us today. So when Alice kindly sort of asked me if I had any idea of something to sort of talk about with this sort of academic year that we've just had, and sort of the chaotic nature of it, but also a very different nature of it, I thought I would ask our four students from the last 4 years, who I taught with Summer Islam for the first 3 years and with Karabo and Paolo this year, to talk about their project, just so that we can just reflect on what we've done for the past 4 years and see where we go from here in this new world. And so I just talk about 5 minutes before I pass on to Karabo to talk about his project. But we started 4 years ago, and the first brief was really kind of stimulated and inspired by the project we did called Leicester Print Workshop in Leicester. And it was a sort of a small art-based project, but it was a very meaningful refurbishment, and how it kind of invigorated the artists in the local community, and eventually the wider city. And I sort of took quite a bit of inspiration from that process, and also working out of London cities, and selfishly as well, rather sort of how can small practices with an interest in design survive in or get work, interesting work like that. And sort of I thought it would be a nice thing to discuss with the students through their projects. And as we got to know a city like Leicester, it was a very interesting thing where we got involved with the city of Leicester, the mayor, but also sort of in terms of the town planning, and the more central you get, you have these kind of empty spaces with retail and mobile phone shops, and with these kind of amazing buildings. So those are the sort of thing that we really wanted to tackle and see what architects can do going forward. And I think the basis of the whole 4 years of work is about this kind of focus on a singular architectural artifact have an influence in a wider city. And of course, there's a very London Met forte, I guess, in that, from Florian Bagel and Phil's kind of approach to bringing the city into a singular building. We were sort of really interested in how just real focus on the singular project, and what can that mean in the wider area. And also, I think the big thing in the 4 projects is how we work with the existing buildings, existing infrastructure, and existing kind of context and social background. I won't go into too much detail, but we started from first year talking quite a bit about Palladio, and this kind of slightly ridiculous comparison between Vicenza and Leicester. And this idea that sort of how can we kind of work with the formal language, but also mainly interested in Palladio's approach to refurbishment. And we actually did some really interesting comparison drawings between Palladio's idealized drawings versus what was actually built in his work, and to really start to kind of investigate the slight differences and adjustments and very clever, smart, what we kind of called in the unit the formal corrections, once dealing with the existing situations. And we discussed a lot about the things like the implication of a plinth in a public environment as a gesture. And we move on to projects in Nottingham second year, through looking at Inigo Jones and the study of procession, and moving on to Stoke-on-Trent, where Monika would talk about the idea of the civic shed, inspired very much by our study of Venturi's both and idea. And then in the final year, this year, we sort of looked at the renewal of Battersea, well, not renewal, but working with Battersea, which is a sort of a quite a chaotic urban plan of mixture, and sort of looked at 7 different sites on purpose to see how these pockets of islands could work against the tackling of a city issue. And each year we had a sort of a very strong kind of reference point, and this year we worked closer with Philip again, but with Jan de Wilde and Inge Vink in Ghent, who kind of proposed for us to look at some really interesting Flemish precedents, and we studied those precedents, and this kind of slightly crazy idea of bringing a precedent into a new context and really kind of start to work with it, to work into the new context. But I think, you know, over the years, maybe we've kind of started from quite sort of formal Palladian studies to maybe sort of more and more interested in the idea of light touch. And this year we sort of looked at how can we do less or enough to make these kind of significant public gestures. I mean, when we say less, I mean, the students have done enormous amount of work and enormous amount of research and work, but it's about sort of as an architectural artifact, how little can you do? A bit like these kind of refurbishment that Palladio was looking at as well, but in a sort of, that can have a kind of powerful impact onto the existing. And I think, you know, I remember when we first started to teach at London Met, now it's called, Florian in one of the crits said, you know, forget thinking about the program for a while. And it was sort of such a delight for me after teaching at the AA for 6 years before then, and to come and just suddenly just really kind of think about these formal gestures. And I think the projects have really, I feel, moved in the last 4 years. And I think next year, hopefully, we'll, you know, this is an opportunity to see where we've got to in the 4 years, but we would probably work in London. I mean, London seems to have enough of its own issues to tackle, not least public space versus COVID and issues of diversity, community gentrification. So there's enough to tackle from the things that we've learned in those Midland cities. Just before I go, more hand drawings maybe next year would be really great after being inspired by Phil, Jan and Inge this year very much. So I'll hand over to Karabo for the first project.
Thanks, Tak. Thanks to Rosie and Alice as well for the opportunity. I'll just share my screen. I hope you can see this. My connection's a bit spotty today, so I apologize if I drop out. So the title of the project is Semper Eadem. The words are Latin, and they're the official motto for the city of Leicester. They translate to mean always the same. The project attempts to arrive at a good public architecture, which is focused on urban renewal from the scale of the public building, a single public building. The project is an experiment in adjacency. It reimagines Leicester's market, and it overlays a cultural program of galleries and community spaces to address its recent stagnation. And renewal is approached in 2 ways. Firstly, through a constructive critique of the recent regeneration of Leicester's market. And secondly, by looking back to Palladio and to the impact of his building projects on the Veneto during the Renaissance. Specifically, the project focuses on the idea of formal correction, which I'll define later, and the use of language. And a dialogue is attempted between the Italian Renaissance and the urban Midlands of today. So Leicester is a Midland city of around 300,000 people. It once thrived on textile and hosiery industries, but these have failed to keep up since the mid-20th century. Since then, factories have mostly become derelict, but the city has also taken on a rich cultural diversity and growing arts and culture scene. This is not really reflected by the fabric of the city centre. Increasingly large retail developments elbow out any other kind of activity, and they create public places where people are compelled to buy things more than anything else. So the city centre itself is defined by this 1960s ring road, which forms its perimeter. Marketplace, which is the site for this project, is highlighted in red, and it sits at the centre of the city. This is an existing ground floor plan of the market. The unit always starts each year with a survey project where we use drawing as a means of investigating a place in detail. Even at this stage, we consider drawing the existing as the first act of design. And so in this case, the market has stood here for 700 years in various iterations. The site is an island bounded on all sides and split roughly into two halves. The upper half of the site contains the market proper, where fixed timber stalls are laid out in a grid, and traders use them 6 days a week from morning until around 4 p.m. Interestingly, Gary Lineker's dad used to sell fruit and veg around here somewhere. And the center of the site is occupied by the 19th century corn exchange, highlighted here, and its recent extension. Meanwhile, the lower half of the site was, at least in 2016 when we were working on it, was under construction, which was following the demolition of a large, very unpopular indoor market building, which has been torn down. So the market takes place under a very large expanse of kind of low metal roof. During the day, the market is vibrant and exciting. And it's a kind of welcome antidote to the retail anonymity elsewhere. But after trading hours, this kind of fixed infrastructure becomes a problem. The square can't really be used for anything else, and it becomes a real dead area, kind of as shown in this photograph. Similarly, the market is slowly failing. It's under pressure from the retail sector, and it's shrinking gradually. And the demographics of its traders don't really reflect the true diversity of Leicester as a city. And so to address some of these issues, the city is proposing to keep the roof in its current place and reinstate or introduce rather, a new public square to the south of the corn exchange. These are elevations of the buildings which enclose the square. The ground floor frontage of these buildings is failing. Many of the buildings actually face away from the square, and several are unoccupied above ground. The market roof also cuts off most long views, either across the square or upwards to the variety of facades. And the site feels a lot smaller than it is. So when you do finally get this view on the bottom across the square, it's actually quite a shock. So the demolition of the indoor market building has created a void between two buildings whose architecture is very much defined by front and back. The first, the 19th century corn exchange, was once a hall for traders and now a Wetherspoons pub. And the second, Molly O'Grady's, is an early 20th century arts and crafts building whose principal elevation kind of outshines its recently exposed party wall shown here. So historically, a building has always occupied this site, which is now open, with an open space to the north of the corn exchange and a building to the south. And critically, as you can see in the first couple of photographs, market stalls were previously kind of demountable and they were moved each day. So in the view of this project, departing from this tradition is counterintuitive, and the proposal addresses this imbalance through a process of formal correction. So the clearest example of formal correction in Palladio's work is his intervention in a piazza in the center of Vicenza, where he found 3 irregular Gothic structures and dressed them in a 2-story classical loggia, which kind of transformed their order and their prominence in the city completely. And the relevance of this process to the project is Palladio's skill in marrying the kind of rigidity and the solipsism of the classical language with the reality of the found condition and of the project. And doing so helped him kind of massively broaden the potential application of the language. And so the impact of a handful of Palladio's project on Vicenza was profound. And the proposal in Leicester attempts a similar ambition. So the primary act of formal correction here is the removal of the market roof and reinstatement of the square as a more flexible open space. The building is also reintroduced in the historic location behind the corn exchange. So on the left is an image of the market as it might become, more open to the sky and to the city. And on the right, the ground floor plan explores the interaction of an imposed cultural program onto the existing market function. The plan itself attempts to be as porous as possible, with entrances aligned to key routes into the site, and it tries to reinforce a sense of this place as a moment of confluence in the city. The geometry of the plan is led by the street to the east, the Corn Exchange, and the third axis, which faces Leicester's Clock Tower just off this page. The Corn Exchange interior is stripped back of the Wetherspoons additions, and it's put back into use as a building for traders. And meanwhile, deeper into the plan, a handful of unconditioned galleries, a cafe, and art handling facilities are arranged around a large central space, which spans the full height of the building. Left is a view of the Corn Exchange interior, the square off to the left of the page, and a new wall in white blockwork, which leads through to the space on the right. I call it a room for Leicester, somewhere between a kind of hall and a piazza. It's deliberately ambiguous, so it might host an indoor market one day or a cultural event the next day, or it might simply serve as a route through the city. It was conceived as a rejection of public space as a stage for retail activity, and it attempts to create a kind of public luxury through scale and articulation. This is a comparison in section between the proposed building on the left and the basilica on the right. The proposal owes a debt to the composition section of Palladio's work, with a central space relating to ancillary surrounding areas. So first and second floor galleries and flexible community rooms sit either side of the main hall, with the program kind of growing more insular further from the ground. In terms of language, trying to pursue this porousness between inside and outside kind of creates an analogy for the interior as a continuation of the street. And as such, the interior walls are treated as though they were facades along a city street, like the courtyard pictured here at Palazzo Barbaron da Porto at Palladio. And so the external language of red blockwork is continued inside, and the floor is made in set paving to match the outside. And the effect on the space is a theatrical one, kind of drawing on the material economy that you see at Villa Foscari, further creates the sense that the facades facing into this space are a kind of stage set. And this theatricality is hopefully heightened by the kind of slightly bonkers adjacency of an indoor market program with galleries above, creating lots of unpredictable exchanges between the two. And Palladio's kind of unity of the rigidity of one thing with the reality of a found condition is explored here tectonically, where the gallery spaces themselves are plumb rectilinear spaces of a uniform width throughout. And as such, a spanning structure of precast concrete planks is proposed, which the project only relies on one size plank throughout. And on the other hand, the irregular interstitial spaces that frame the galleries are made in timber, which is easily adjusted to suit the shifts in geometry of the site and its context. Openings are placed selectively in these areas to frame views of the facades enclosing the square, which is a kind of inverse of the current condition where they're invisible. And the upper levels of the building above the rectilinear galleries are a series of generic community spaces which are made available to the public for a variety of uses. So shown here, artist studio, recreation room, and music lessons are three imagined conditions. Similarly to the main hall, they are concerned primarily with serving as a stage for the life of the city to play out. Externally, the treatment of the facades explores the relationship between the square and the facades that encloses it. The surrounding facades are typical of a tradition throughout the UK, which is the mixture of masonry and moulding to create articulation. So coloured blockwork is proposed here as a masonry separate from, but still in dialogue to, the brickwork of the square. And moulding is approached by placing bespoke concrete elements within the blockwork facade to form cornices and other decorative details, which is seen kind of over here. These elements are an opportunity to stray from the otherwise economical, standardized approach to construction. And three one-to-one models shown here are experiments in concrete imitating fabric, which is a kind of nod to Leicester's industrial past as a textiles hub. So these elements are then deployed to form lintels and cornices on the internal and external facades, such as here, which is the gallery entrance facing Hotel Street. And looking back to Palladio and the classical language more generally, the project kind of focuses on traviation, so the post and the beam as a tool to create civic prominence. So this articulation of post and beam is kind of stripped back to a primitive expression here, and entrances are composed in passing resemblance to the Serlian arches at the basilica pictured here. And so unlike its predecessor, which is pictured below, the proposed building attempts a kind of more convivial relationship with its immediate neighbors. The datum set by surrounding buildings inform the height and the composition of the facades. For example, shown here, the building diminishes in scale as it steps away from the spectacle of the square. The quieter edge of the site here is dedicated to back-of-house gallery facilities. Meanwhile, as the building meets the rear of the Corn Exchange, it steps back slightly before growing taller to create a public viewing level otherwise missing in Leicester. This platform tries to create the inverse of the current relationship between the square and its context. Where the market currently stifles connection to the city beyond, the proposed adjustment hopes to celebrate the city more overtly. In doing so, the market and square can perform as they always have, but in such a way as to incorporate the city's true current and future diversity. If this can be accomplished, it can live up to the city's motto of always the same, or sempre et. Thank you. And I'll hand over to Ross and Nottingham.
Thanks, Karabo. I'll share my screen. Okay, thanks Rosie and Ellis for having us. This project is given the title The City Unveiled. It's both an urban proposal for a fragmented city centre and a new home for the Nottingham Arts Theatre. We began the year focusing on the work of a single architect, just like Palladio, but we chose Inigo Jones and thought about his work's position in the city, specifically medieval London, and its relationship to the wider European context of the Renaissance. Okay, a series of seminars examine texts on Jones and other architects more explicitly concerned with the architecture of the city, like Rossi or Rowley. So the unit responded to these as a series of drawings, making stage sets from Inigo Jones' work. Jones is credited with introducing the architecture of Rome and the Renaissance to the British Isles. Very little of his work has survived or was even built, but for some halls of Covent Garden, the Queen's House in Greenwich, and a few others. And these were all his understanding and translation of an architecture seen abroad in Italy. So although he never addresses the topic of an ideal architecture for the city, we can see that his work follows a traditional royal procession for the Stuart monarchs. So this drawing shows St. Paul's on the left and the Thames to the north, winding down to Whitehall on the right. So each project or artifact is working individually to address that Stuart monarchs procession through the city. So our city for the year was Nottingham. We started to look at what procession might mean in a contemporary sense and how that might be relevant to the city. So primarily this project is a response to an increasingly common urban condition coming from public spaces falling into private hands, sold off, and hopefully that market forces will ultimately mend the city's ills. So like many cities, Nottingham has been suffering from this for over half a century. It's a medieval city set on a hill. It's grown out from its ramparts and to the marshland below, kind of sprawling in an ungainly fashion towards the south. And through this sprawl, a path that would later become Carrington Street persisted until the late 1950s. So that's leading from Nottingham Central train station right through to the heart of the city. At that point, a neo-Gothic water fountain used to stand at the convergence of two quite important arteries from the south up until the early 60s. It was erased from the city's memory with the construction of the Broadmoor Shopping Centre, which is highlighted in red, and its impact on the city is huge. Cut off streets and internalizing public squares and sterilizing city life in the process. And developers have been trying for almost 15 years to give the shopping centre a facelift. Their proposals for glazed links and enclosed public streets and squares are cynical and deceitful in the use of supposed visual transparency in lieu of actual permeability. The project's first move is to suggest a new path through, open to the sky, and return to the city. A cultural statement and framework for Nottingham asks for public spaces enriched by culture. So all the notable cultural institutions in Nottingham, none are able to engage directly with the city's squares as places of gathering. An opportunity to address this sits just beyond the Broadmoor Centre at the centre of the city, and a row of quite tired retail buildings, a handful of which are derelict and by and large unremarkable retail space and empty from first floor and above. So the first photograph on the left is what you're greeted with as you emerge from the shopping centre. It's not a bad street. As you move along it, it's lined with trees, and it gradually reveals the city's topography as you move along, but it feels quite empty, or rather is lacking any real sense of arrival to the centre of quite an important city. So at the top of that street, Listergate, you meet Castlegate. It's this steep journey across the city from east to west, directly from the Castle District in the east to the Lace Market in the west. So the proposal is for a theatre building in a pavilion on the reinstated Listergate Square. So as you pass through the Broadmoor Centre, the red volumes of the theatre reveal themselves stepping along the street with the city's topography. And then from these volumes, a canopy drapes over the street and foyer below. The design for the project is essentially a dialogue on drapery between procession and theatre. And the confluence of these two readings of the draped fabric is used throughout the project to convey ideas about movement and theatricality. So thinking of how best to provide a contribution to the Broadmoor Centre's vast structural grid, the ambition for this proposal is to have a light touch on the ground. So by concentrating the load-bearing structure to the inner volumes of the theatre and two standalone columns, the foyer can hopefully be lighter on the ground, and the facade can feel lighter on the street. The foyer is like a pre-cambered wood concrete slab inverted to feel like a tent roof. It's unlike Jornit Sons Bagsberg Kirker. So instead of arriving at W.H. Smith's door, you would hopefully move through the open street of the Broadmoor Centre to approach the reinstated public square, giving you a stronger sense of arrival. The ground floor of this theatre building is one long stepping topography. So after the stage set design of Adolf Appia, the foyer space steps up and along the city like an open stage. The shifting terrain gives a theatrical quality to movement through the foyer and into the theatres within. A large Venetian curtain runs the length of the street, implying a theatricality in both city life outside and the theatre foyer within. The foyer is loose, enjoys a degree of ambiguity in its furnishing, much like that of a series of stages or scenes. The city pours in and out, up and down along Listergate. The steep incline of low pavement gives the site an opportunity to stand taller than its more immediate context, marking its position as a fulcrum point in the city. So at the corner, the building steps back to give views past along the narrow streets to breathe a little. So after Candelato's painting of the feast day of St. Roch, slender concrete posts prop up the undulating roof along the street. And the facades responding to the city is trying to embody the processional relationship between north and south. It's for moving past and for moving through. Similarly, the facade twists run up Castlegate, invite movement to and from low pavement. So on Castle Gate, the red volume of the theatre says hello to its neighbours. Openings in the red volumes above rhyme with the draped concrete slabs below. This flattened motif allows the proposer to rhyme in some way with its neighbours. The building is given a soft, concave cladding like that of a resting curtain. The red is taken from the red of the theatre curtain, but could also be understood as a concentration of the red brick warehouses throughout the city. A long section shows the rake of the small theatre built into the hill, where the street leads into the theatre at first floor level. However abstract, there's an ambition here to draw parallels between the theatre Argos and its use of the landscape's inherent theatricality. And then looking again, Argos, borrowing the red velarium that hangs from the ceiling. It conceals gantries and lighting and other services and provides a kind of soft acoustic ceiling. The stage is open on three sides for the most part, to each crowd and to the foyer where practicable. So Nottingham has been seen and imagined from the south for centuries, and each depiction stays on the city's monuments and topography. The city is often given a flat, stage-like quality observed from the fields and marshland below. The theatre stage in this proposal sits in the centre of that. The audience of the larger theatre face the city from the south, imagined somewhere in the centre and as a part of this etching. So each monument in the city is imagined together. The public space of Listergate Square can be a formal theatre or a more indeterminate piece of public furniture, implying a stage, but acting also as a place to rest. Moments like this invite the public to engage in active theatre knowingly or not, and it's ultimately it's a place for people watching and being watched. Rather than internalizing streets of the Broadmoor Centre, the foyer gives space for the city to breathe amidst the constant pressure to consume. Benches, food kiosks, or loose furniture in general could all be make it a flexible room. It could be a temporary exhibition space or an event space all at once. It's a room for the city, architecture that is inherently civic, conceived with the city in mind. That's all.
Thank you, Ross.
Okay, so I will continue from here. This third year of Unitate's work, and this project in particular, is an example of how lightness, this notion of lightness and weight can be used as a tool for formal intervention into public realm. And throughout the year, this was guided by three other conditions. And the first one was a very intense discussion on using sustainable methods of construction in architecture. The second was the context in Stoke-on-Trent, and the third one was the writings of Robert Venturi in his book Complexity and Contradiction and the Notion of Bowhand. Stoke-on-Trent is a city that emerged through the agglomeration of 6 individual towns, which came together without having a perceptible urban center. And within these cities, there are 2 typologies that shape them, one of which is the industrial typology, which creates quite a sparse urban grain today due to the demolition of many of these industrial factories. This condition is then contradicted by the presence of quite a few very monumental public buildings, which currently are not able to be used. They are too expensive to maintain, but at the same time, they're too inefficient and not able to cope with the ways we use buildings today. And in this context of quite opposing typologies. Venturi's notion of his idea and his theory of embracing contradiction instead of trying to navigate between certain conditions, but more importantly, trying to consolidate them into a single piece is a guiding principle. So the project suggests dealing with these contradictory typologies, neither of which is able to carry a meaningful public platform in these cities, by proposing an individual building and a new urban center in a city that has grown without having one. And the way in which this building is inserted into the larger public realm can be presented and be exemplified by this smaller scale intervention into the current town hall in Stoke, whereby new doors and windows in the building are referencing pottery made in Stoke-on-Trent and used in architectural elements such as the door handle in this proposal to create an element that at the same time interacts as little with the existing fabric, but is able to shape the context of this existing fabric in such a way that interacting with this door, such as opening and closing it, is able to portray the existing building in a new way and allows a new viewing and a new appreciation of this building. In a similar way, the proposal is inserted into the context not as an object which is intended to be a monument there, but rather as a object that completes a certain sequence of buildings that are already there, and completing a space with its facade, which allows the newly created square to be a viewing platform, not only for one of these buildings, but of a whole ensemble of buildings to be appreciated thanks to this new space. Formally, the building separates the existing car park into two spaces. To the north, of a more formal square, and to the south, a more informal one, but also provides an opportunity for connecting these spaces through the use of large doors, which can connect and create a single public realm together with the whole inside the building. The building connects to the language of the potteries by adopting the typology of a civic shed and achieves civic generosity, not through monumentality, but through generosity of space, typical of the industrial typology. A large homogeneous roof spans over the spaces underneath, and through the intersection with the geometry underneath creates a different setting under each of these spaces. In contrast to this homogeneous roof, each facade is quite, it exaggerates the context directly in front and around it in order to negotiate the specific context which it faces. In this way, each of these facades is able to be a background and avoid creating a certain hierarchy of front and back, but at the same time allows different conditions to happen according to the different uses of the site, such as the opening of this door, allowing for the large hole inside the building to change from being the largest space within the building to a small room which is attached to a larger public space. In a similar way, the facade facing the city is characterized by symmetry and repetition, but is then contradicted by a large open public space behind it. Inside, platforms combine with galleries on both levels, allowing different layers of experiencing the space. For example, from speaking at the central pulpit to moving through the different levels of the platforms, or through going all the way behind the facade and observing from a sheltered corner. And then the third way in which the notion of both and is explored comes in through the detail of the building, where the initial study of the whole unit into the existing vocabulary and language of architecture found throughout the 6 towns is condensed in search of the more quintessential carriers of this monumentality, such as the scale and the proportion, and then presented through the means of the industrial architecture, such as lighter materials and lighter construction, in an effort to find the balance combined in a single detail, which is able to convey both the monumentality and weight of civic buildings, but also the simplicity and necessity driving the architecture of industrial buildings. In this way, trying to condense into a single building a way to democratize a town shaped by different typologies, similar to the way a single element in this building is able to democratize the building itself. Thank you.
Thanks, Monika. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Drew. What I'm going to do is briefly talk about the unit's working methods from this year, then bring that into my own thesis project before finally showing a really small selection of work from colleagues and classmates so we can see the diversity of the unit's work this year. I'm going to have to generalize a little, unfortunately, about other people's work, but all of it's available on liveness.org.uk, which is the summer show website, so please have a look. We spent the first semester with a sort of spirit of collaboration, working with Architecten de Wildervinck-Tillou from Belgium, with Jan and Kana on the right here, and also Phil, who was around a lot for the first semester, helping us with that project. Working in groups, as usual, we started surveying a site within the turbulent context of Battersea, after which surveys of villas and one chapel in Belgium, which were selected by Jan and Inge of ADVVT. We used line drawings, photography, models, and gestalt drawings and models, which were an attempt to abstract what we were trying to perceive as the essence of the buildings. We then transcribed these buildings onto the Battersea sites. We took these essences and applied it to the sites using similar working methods, collages, abstract sketches, drawings, models, etc. These projects, while done with great care, can be in a way viewed as perhaps a little bit naive in that they're not interested in program or practicalities, but instead are a way through blending to find the latent possibilities of the Battersea sites, but also the qualities of the prototypes that we found particularly compelling. All of this work is at a show in VAI in Antwerp, which might be difficult to get to at the moment, but there's a link to an e-version of the show on the Liveness website. So it was from these sort of revealed possibilities that many of us would go on to develop our own thesis proposals. And my own project, the renewed Covent Garden Market, began by applying the prototype of Palwinning, which translates to Stilt House, by the architect and artist Rennie Hafer, to the new Covent Garden Market site in Battersea, which is a large fruit and vegetable wholesalers market. It's currently going through regeneration, and it basically, if you've eaten produce in London, you've had food that's come through this market. And here it is in the current condition, a little bit shabby, but very, very large and very, very intense. Palwinning, on the other hand, is a small object-like villa, set almost classically in the landscape, with a primary facade that faces onto a lawn. It's built with simple timber members and is clad in sheet materials. The interior is currently arranged around a series of overlapping spatially variable rooms comprised of sliding walls. However, since its construction, the building has undergone continuous renewal, and its current condition is quite different from the original project, which was built in the summer of '68 by Hafer and his brother. The house has gone through no less than 4 quite major alterations, yet the careful attention to detail, the assembly of lightweight ordinary materials, and the overall composition of the house have been respected even as its program has been added and amended. The transcription was approached in this way. Me and my colleague Adam maintained the frame of the market and its current uses, but opened the now redundant buyer's walks that sit at the center of the market, transforming them into arcades. We retained the use of the wholesalers on the lower level, but improved the office units above, which often are disused, so they could be separated from the work below. All of this was done taking key design moves from Hafert's villa. So the retained frame on the right and the left, sorry, and the proposal on the right. And this would go on to be developed further into my own project. The transcription revealed the possibility of the market as an artifact that could be renewed in a manner that has a continuity with the existing, but that was still a radical reimagining of the urban market and what this could be in terms of a civic space within the city. The thesis ultimately proposes an alternative to the current regeneration strategy, which is going to replace the existing market fabric entirely and completely isolate it from the city. Instead, the existing market fabric is renewed, civic uses are retained, and the market is loaded with additional public and commercial programming. In November, we visited Berlin and undertook further surveys, which we called sampling. The parklands of Schinkel offered a reference for me for various parts of the thesis. At Charlottenhof Schloss, an existing farmhouse was transformed by Schinkel. The resulting building is described as an idiosyncratic object that shifts languages and styles depending on the viewer's vantage point. So the Doric portico that's viewed from a distance, employing Doric and the austerity of that, whereas the Egyptian entrance, which is approached through essentially an orchard and is met very immediately, has the Egyptian style, which is much more subtle in its geometry and its detail and these changes. The sampling gave rise to the view of the renewal of the market as a series of artifacts that became things like the tower, or the towers, the arcade, the concourse that sits at the center in between the buildings, and the boulevard on the left of this drawing. A campus of various objects that are sort of contribute to a somewhat an idiosyncratic whole. So to go through these elements and where they came from a little bit, the towers, as well as containing new commercial spaces within the market, act as markers leading pedestrians through the campus. These sketches are trying to find a sort of strong sense of hierarchy on their facades with differing fronts and gables, relating to the language of Schinkel, but also trying to find a way that these taller elements could be indicators of where the arcade sits and where pedestrians should move. The position of the towers was derived from the 2 main entrances to the site, coming from the east in the previous images from Nine Elms, and in these images from the north, from basically Battersea Power Station. With the ambition of opening the market up to the city, emphasis is put on pedestrian movement within the landscape, and the main north-south route through the site, which was nicknamed the Boulevard, also manipulates the existing frame, creating bollards, lampposts, and pergolas, which have their own functions, pergolas marking the entrance to crossings, and the rest of them helping separate vehicular traffic and pedestrians. This boulevard connects the buildings and the arcade, so we're looking perpendicularly across it here. And from the arcade, we can access from the arcade, we can access the towers, which have sort of gained this strong sense of orientation, which is about wayfinding again. The new towers are thought of as a frame, and they're made of CLT and glulam and clad in a light rain screen cladding. The structure of the frame was explored in quite some detail. this height timber buildings typically get concrete floors in order to help brace them and reduce swaying. But instead of concealing this within the internal buildup, they become used as a cap on top, so sort of celebrating the limited use of the concrete, but also creating an overhang on the front facade that reinforces the orientation, which is, to go back to transcription, a move taken directly from Hafer. The towers are thought of as an additional type of frame within the market campus. They're set out as commercial office space, basically, but are capable of accommodating a variety of uses. The exposed services let services be flexible over time. Overskilled structure allows for greater weight than just office on the floor. And in addition to standard size lifts, there's goods lifts as well. So they can accommodate uses as varied from offices to workshops to contract florists, as they're being shown in this image, trying to encourage sort of productive institutions within the market campus. Ultimately, the market is thought of as a frame. There's already an exceptional example of civic use within the market, which is the Sunday flea market. And as you can see by this screenshot from Google from 2010, it's as vast as the market. So in addition to existing commercial uses being retained, uses like this are retained. So I'm going to try and use the flea market to relate this back to the unit theme of lightness and weight. So there's lightness in an environmental sense from the renewal of the fabric rather than replacing it, the retention of the existing uses as well, of the lightweight materials used in the new additions, of the overall architectural language of the project, whereas the weight of the project is trying to come from the proposal trying to be an intense sort of amenity for the city, a proper urban market, that instead of a marginalized commercial space made of blank warehouses, which is what the new regeneration is going to create, the market is taken as an urban thing with density and plurality of uses from the commercial through to the civic, essentially trying to use a light architectural touch to create a thing of great civic weight. And just briefly looking at other projects throughout the unit this year with similar lightness of touch is employed, re-inhabiting disused buildings and spaces, but creating civic intensity and weight in these marginalized spaces through the reuse of existing things and taking the existing exceptionally seriously. So this a couple of images from Michelle's thesis, where she transformed underused spaces within a residential development. And she considered the entire thing an incomplete monastery and draws analogies with studios, etc., as monks' cells. Lucia proposed included new civic spaces and frontage to a school which is very closed off from the city. She explores this through a series of really careful and intimate details. Kay transformed an existing pumping station into a new node on the south bank, which contains galleries and civic space along the river, which is really lacking within the Battersea redevelopment. Abbey is amended and improved the ground plane of his existing estate with community gardens, kitchens and common spaces, to name just a few of the new spaces within the garden landscape. And lastly, Rebecca proposed a hybrid of garden centre and educational spaces on a complex and underutilized site around a railway infrastructure that draws on the language of infrastructure and residential and civic uses clashing together. So yeah, just a few examples of the work from this year, which is again all on liveness.org, org.uk, and there's also complete portfolios up there as well if people would like to see those.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your presentations. It was really beautiful kind of seeing the projects presented in that format, like one after the other. There aren't any questions in the chat, but if you have some, just let me know. But yeah, I think I felt it was interesting kind of seeing the kind of visual cohesion between the language of the architecture in those 4 projects and also the way that they're presented. But I guess another commonality between the projects is the kind of the way that they emphasize the public space that they're adjoining. And like over the past few months, we've kind of seen that public space is as important as it's ever been. And these are spaces where people can exercise their right to protest. Yeah, especially when you're locked inside your homes, those spaces become far more important. I guess it's not really a question, it's just a thought. But kind of where do you see the studio going next year, Tak, now that you've kind of had these 4 years, and Karabo as well?
I don't know, to be honest. I mean, we're writing the brief at the moment, but it's just a very strange time in the sense of, you know, we will be having this kind of tutorials on Zoom and Teams, and the direct physical interaction might be less, but nevertheless, it's about sort of trying to, I mean, what was really kind of quite interesting during the lockdown was the sort of how many handmade materials were coming out of every student, and kind of working with the economy of means. I mean, the economy of means is something that's running through the whole kind of 4 years, you know, like studying even Palladio's economy of means to, I think Drew's project is much more about these kind of working with standardized products and materials to make a civic space. And I was very intrigued by what Drew just said about the weight is the civic public space. And I don't remember talking about that with Drew before, and that's a very inspiring way of looking at something that's kind of weighty. And I think we're going to move more and more towards looking at these kind of actual public spaces. And yeah, we're keen to collaborate again next year with another mode of practice or architect, in order to kind of pursue more of these, it's just sort of things beyond just forms. Well, not just forms, but beyond forms, in order to think about these kind of, what does it mean to actually engage in a public space going forward, without necessarily reverting to just urban planning or kind of infrastructure design. But yeah, it's been very interesting to see the 4 projects together like that. And to see how especially like in, I think during the Ross and Monika's projects, I think those years we were really looking at the ductility and the richness of the color and the interior and, interiority, you know, the city coming into the interior, and this whole idea of the public space carrying on into the theatre space or the civic shed. And there's sort of a very sort of strong tactile richness in those projects. And I think, you know, I really enjoy the kind of actually more pragmatic approach this year of really looking at the environmental aspects, but also sort of discussing a lot these kind of detail, lightness in terms of the detail and construction. And to see what we can actually achieve with sort of very, very sort of limited budget or economy of means, much more. So that was very fascinating to see. I think that, you know, I think what we are discussing more and more at London Met is sort of across unit discussions, and maybe forming next year's briefs, but based on more debate with other units, and sort of having a more connected, I mean, it's already a very, I find it's already a very collegial place, and, you know, it's one of the most together kind of architecture schools I've taught in, and I think I think it would probably be even more so going forward, where I'm sure there's going to be a lot more cross crits and discussions across different units. And actually, you know, I found earlier on that it's a school with quite a sort of focused approach, but actually the diversity is strong when you really look at what Tony Fretton's doing, with very kind of strong kind of classical studies, and what James Assemble is looking at with the sort of real kind of interest in the community spaces and productive land, with Pierre Davoine, similar way, and sort of extremely exquisite form and facade studies that Peter Sinjan's doing. I mean, there's the variety actually within that kind of coherent body of studies, I think is very strong. So I'm sure there'll be more of that going forward.
We have a question from Matthew Barrick. Matthew, you're unmuted.
Hi. Yeah, I was, well, I kind of was framing a question which was going to go out to everyone, including Tak, but Tak has just had the floor for a bit, so maybe this is for Karabo, Drew, Monika, and Ross. But there's this thing that I keep coming back to especially when I look over the 4 years, and obviously I know the work of unit work very well, and when Tak started teaching at London Met, I was the course leader of the Part 2 course, which I no longer am. But I just think that there's something about the work of this unit. I hear the position that is presented very much in the thread of the architectural research unit and so on. But the thing that keeps coming back to me is the theatricality of the way that these very serious issues are addressed. And it's a kind of a very measured theatricality in some ways, but there is definitely something about the desire to make the architecture somehow speak and communicate, and yet be laconic at the same time. And I'm taken back, I know that quite a number of people here were at the event on Friday, with Andrew Clancy and Shumi Bose and Michael Badu and several other speakers looking at criticality in architecture. And there was a lot of discussion about what critical architecture might mean, critical practice, and what criticality should be for architecture, when really, you know, if architecture is made of bricks and stones and wood, these are things that are inert, they don't really speak. But if we are saying that critical architecture should say something, it should perform in some way, it should be on the one hand, but it should think on the other hand. I think a lot of the theatricality of these buildings is that they're wanting to be kind of standing back and be quiet and resolute and be backdrops and be background, but at the same time they want to engage and be involved. So that's a bit of a long way around, but I think what I'm coming back to for your students, Tak, and now Karabo, and Summer, I think, is still here, is in this way about learning about buildings being part of the city, but also performing to the city, perhaps being a soapbox for that city, in these performative buildings, or buildings that take a stand or take a stance. What have you learned about how to be an architect? I think a lot of being an architect is about creating a backdrop, or creating something that doesn't get in the way or that responds to the brief. But do you think that this way of making these performative architectures produces a different kind of architect? And that's the end of my question.
I think so. I think maybe the thing that I realized looking back today is, I think a lot of what you learn in the unit is about how to be naive. I think it's fair to say that all 4 projects are preceded by, you know, intense long periods of self-questioning and doubt before arriving at a brief which kind of appears, you know, deceptively simple. And, you know, I think I enjoy that. I enjoy the kind of contrast and that irony between the representation, which kind of fakes a lot of resolution and reality, and a kind of real naivety in program and in, you know, in terms of like engaging with the city that we actually live in today. And, you know, that spirit is obviously counter to a lot of contemporary practice, but I think that attitude that you pick up along the way is, you know, it's been helpful to me in my, you know, short professional time so far. Don't know if the others agree.
Ross and Monika, I think your projects are very theatrical.
Yeah, I think the theatricality was kind of inevitable. I mean, we were looking at Inigo Jones and the Renaissance and a lot of these things. That's kind of at the fore of their study. Like Inigo Jones was a set designer, and he designed masks. And yeah, I think it's, I don't know. I don't really know what else to say about it, other than it seems to be a thread that's run through all 4 projects. Yes.
Yeah, I might add that actually these two opposing things of being a part of the background and actually performing, yeah, it is also a part of the theater, which while you experience going to the theater, there are moments where you only observe this stage set without anything happening in there. And then the whole performance goes into actually this stage set doing what it traditionally does, being a background to all the activity. So perhaps it is quite an important thing to be aware of how a certain project needs to position itself on this line of how often it would need to be as close to these two opposing conditions, and when and how.
We have a question from David Phillips, if you want to ask it, David.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I lost it in the chat, but I was just, first of all, great projects, and I think I might even have been to an inter and crit on one of the Stoke unit, or maybe you did it 2 years, I'm not sure. But I was interested in about the way that when we look at what Palladio was doing with Roman architecture and completely sort of turning it inside out by rescaling, and whether any of the students had some sort of comments on what we might learn from that, you know, in a contemporary context. Yeah, somebody.
I think the best example,
not addressed to anybody, could be to you, Tak.
the best example is probably Drew's appropriation of Schinkel in a warehouse in Bastille.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we started not really, we were interested in that contrast between the domestic and the commercial, and putting this tiny little villa, but repeating it 50 times along this arcade changed things quite dramatically. I can only talk about within the context of my own thesis, but I think what I was drawn to in that is that it suddenly made the whole site feel more like a real bit of city. At the moment, it's just this expansive warehouse that is all uniform in its scale. And the introduction of these smaller spaces sort of began to encourage ideas about, oh, well, is there other things that happen on top of this? I suppose it's about thinking about the city as like a plurality of things all stacked on top of each other rather than zoned off. Don't know if that's just a question.
We've just got a question from Phil Christo as well. Yeah, Phil, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me now? Hi. Now I just was wondering, there's wonderful projects and very, very well presented, extremely articulate, and all 4 of you, wonderful. I'm just now thinking that this is a kind of retrospective event. You know, we're looking back over 4 years. and looking back at your projects, this time has gone by now, and do you think that, not only bringing ideas and things from other places like Indigo Jones brought from Italy, or bringing Palladio into England and so on, but do you think that your own cultural backgrounds have somehow informed the projects that you've done? Like, the cultural backgrounds, meaning like your experiences as children at home, growing up with your parents wherever you came from, or what you brought before you started studying architecture.
Anyone want to start? Oh, Monika?
I think for me there is more of a personal attitude that is in line with other things that I do. So some kind of consciousness, for example, that I can't really forget when it comes to making decisions about projects. So more character that I find is somehow portrayed in the project, maybe is not evident from looking from the other side, but for example, I don't know, acceptance of, I don't know, I lost my thought.
Character?
I think sometimes personal attitude and yes, character.
Yeah. So can you be specific? Can you say more?
I'm not sure of a specific example.
Okay. I don't know. I think that would. I mean, I like it when that happens. When there's something comes out from the inside of one's own experience. That might. It's not necessarily explicitly meant, like to be that, but it does sort of naturally come out, and you find it happening. I quite like that when that happens. It's after the event, really, that you realize, I suppose.
Yeah, I don't know about bringing things from like childhood and stuff, but I've been really fortunate in that I've managed to study essentially architecture at 4 different institutions in 4 different cities. And I think that there's a continuity between ideas that are coming through, but then moving to a new place, suddenly you find something to almost resist every time. And I think that, in my sort of undergraduate with an exchange to Germany, there's this sort of focus on like precision and things, but then moving to London, suddenly things become a completely different scale. And I was really drawn to the site this year because of that. And I know that that's something I would not have instinctively gone for otherwise. I think that,
that's like a response to your background, huh?
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Tak, do you have any closing comments for?
Well, no, thank you very much. That was very inspiring to look back, and it was also nice to have Summer here, who I taught with for 3 years. I think she's now left, but and to sort of see so many people that have actually helped these students, like not just obviously 4 of them, but the unit for the 4 years had so many kind of inputs from different critics and seminars, etc. Obviously, and the school. Matthew is there, but and to have a really strong core of support from Philip and Peter, and you know, I think they're very lucky students to get such a wide, a strong support. So thank you, AF, for arranging this, for letting them speak. It's great.